In the summer of 1976, 3 children were found living in a root cellar beneath what locals called the Fowler property, deep in the backwoods of eastern Kentucky. They had no birth certificates, no medical records, no photographs. When state officials finally took blood samples, the results came back with a notation that would be sealed for 30 years. Genetic markers inconsistent with known human populations. The lab technician who processed the samples quit 2 days later and never spoke publicly about what she saw. The children were separated, their files buried under layers of bureaucratic red tape, and the Fowler property was burned to the ground by persons unknown. This is not a legend. This is not folklore. This is a story that was deliberately erased from public memory. And tonight we're going to uncover why. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Fowler clan had lived in those mountains since before the Civil War, maybe longer. They kept to themselves in a way that went beyond privacy. It was isolation as religion, as survival, as something darker that nobody wanted to name. The nearest town was Harlan, about 17 miles down a road that turned to mud 6 months out of the year. Folks in Harlan knew about the Fowlers the way you know about a wasp nest in your attic. You don't go looking. You don't ask questions. You just accept that some things are better left alone. But in 1976, a social worker named Margaret Vance decided she couldn't leave it alone anymore. She'd heard rumors about children up on that property, children who'd never been seen by a doctor or a teacher or anyone from the outside world. She'd heard other things too, whispers that made her stomach turn. Stories about lights in the woods and sounds that didn't match any animal anyone could name. Margaret Vance drove up that mountain on a Tuesday morning in June. And what she found would haunt her until the day she died 43 years later, never having spoken a word about it to anyone outside that investigation. The Fowler property sat at the end of a path that couldn't honestly be called a road. Margaret Vance had to abandon her car half a mile down and walk the rest of the way through woods so thick the sunlight barely touched the ground. She said later in her sealed testimony that the silence was the first thing that struck her. No birds, no insects, just the sound of her own breathing and the crack of twigs under her feet. When she finally reached the clearing, she found a structure that looked like it had been built and rebuilt over generations. Rooms added without any logic. Wood rotting into wood. Windows covered with tar paper and cloth. There was a smell she couldn't identify. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in a warm place. She called out. Nobody answered. She called again. And that's when she heard it. A sound from below the ground beneath the house. Children's voices, but not speaking any language she recognized. Not English, not any native dialect she'd ever heard, something older or something made up, or something that should never have been taught to human mouths. Margaret found the entrance behind the house, hidden under a wooden door, so weathered it looked like part of the earth itself. The root cellar went down further than any root cellar had a right to go, maybe 15 feet, with walls made of stacked stone and clay. And at the bottom, in the dim light filtering through cracks in the floorboards above, she found them. 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, aged somewhere between 8 and 12, though their exact ages would never be determined with certainty. They were pale in a way that went beyond lack of sunlight. Their skin had an almost translucent quality, blue veins visible like rivers on a map. Their eyes were large, too large, and reflected light like an animal's eyes caught in a flashlight beam. They didn't cry when they saw her. They didn't run. They just stared at her with an expression Margaret would later describe as recognition. As though they'd been expecting her, as though they'd known someone would eventually come. The children were wearing clothes that looked handmade, stitched from fabric that might have been flour sacks or old curtains stained with dirt and something darker. Their hair had been cut short, almost shaved. And when Margaret moved closer, she saw markings on their scalps. Not scars exactly. Symbols carved or burned into the skin, healed over but still visible, circles within circles. Lines that branched like tree roots or veins. She asked them their names. The oldest girl opened her mouth and made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something between a hum and a whisper that made Margaret's teeth ache. She asked them where their parents were. The boy pointed up toward the house. And then he pointed down toward the earth beneath their feet. And Margaret realized she didn't want to know what that meant. She radioed for backup. Within 3 hours, the property was swarming with county sheriffs, state police, and 2 men in unmarked suits who never showed identification but took control of everything the moment they arrived. The children were removed from the property that same day, wrapped in blankets and carried to waiting vehicles, while police swept through the Fowler house looking for evidence of who had kept them there and why. What they found was worse than anyone expected. The house had been abandoned, but not recently. Dust lay thick on every surface. Food in the cupboards had rotted to powder. The furniture was arranged in strange configurations. Chairs facing walls, tables turned upside down, beds torn apart with the mattresses shredded and scattered. In what might have been a kitchen, investigators found jars lined up on shelves. Hundreds of them were filled with preserved organs that later analysis would determine came from multiple species. Some were recognizable: deer hearts, rabbit kidneys. Others defied classification. The medical examiner who cataloged them refused to speculate on their origin, but his notes included phrases like unknown mammalian tissue and cellular structure inconsistent with regional fauna. But it was the room in the back, the one with the door nailed shut from the outside, that made 2 of the officers request immediate transfers off the case. Inside, the walls were covered floor to ceiling with writing, not English, not any alphabet anyone on site could identify. The symbols matched the markings found on the children's scalps. Mixed in with the writing were drawings, crude but disturbingly detailed, showing figures that might have been human but weren't quite right. Too many joints in the fingers, eyes positioned slightly wrong on the face. In the center of the room was a table, and on that table were leather straps worn smooth from use and stained with substances that would later test positive for human blood. 3 different blood types, all of them matching the children found in the root cellar. The men in the unmarked suits photographed everything, then ordered the room sealed. By the next morning, those photographs had disappeared from evidence storage, and the 2 officers who'd entered the room first were told in no uncertain terms that they'd seen nothing worth remembering. The children were taken to a facility in Lexington, a place that officially didn't exist in any state records but had been used before for cases the government wanted kept quiet. They were separated immediately, placed in different wings, examined by doctors who'd signed clearance papers and non-disclosure agreements before being allowed anywhere near them. The initial medical reports painted a picture that should have been impossible. The children's bone density was wrong, too light for their apparent age and size. Their internal temperature ran consistently lower than normal human baseline, hovering around 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Their hearts beat at a rate that should have indicated severe bradycardia. Yet they showed no signs of distress. Blood work revealed abnormalities that the examining physician, Dr. Raymond Hull, described in his notes as requiring immediate consultation with geneticists and possibly virologists. But before those consultations could happen, before anyone could make sense of what they were seeing, the children's samples were flagged by a lab technician named Patricia Gomez, and everything changed. Patricia Gomez had been working in the genetics lab at the University of Kentucky for 11 years when the Fowler children's blood samples crossed her desk. She was experienced, methodical, not prone to mistakes or dramatics. She'd processed thousands of samples, seen countless variations within normal human genetic ranges. But when she ran the analysis on the first child's blood, the second child's blood, and then the third, she sat at her workstation for 20 minutes in complete silence before picking up the phone to call her supervisor. The karyotype was wrong. The chromosome count was correct. 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs, but the banding patterns were off. There were sequences that shouldn't exist, genetic markers that didn't correspond to any known human haplogroup. When she ran the samples through comparison databases looking for maternal and paternal lineages, the computer returned errors, unable to place the children within any established human population group. Not European, not African, not Asian or Indigenous American. The genetic signatures were isolated, unique, as though these children had descended from a lineage that had split off from the rest of humanity so long ago that the divergence had become fundamental. Patricia ran the tests again, thinking contamination, thinking lab error, thinking anything except what the results were telling her. The numbers came back the same. She expanded her analysis, looking at mitochondrial DNA, the genetic information passed down through the maternal line with almost no variation over thousands of years. In normal samples, mitochondrial DNA tells a story of human migration, of populations moving across continents of common ancestry traced back to Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. The Fowler children's mitochondrial DNA told a different story. The sequences were ancient, older than they should have been, with mutation rates that suggested separation from known human lineages for a period that Patricia's calculations put somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 years. But that wasn't possible. There were no isolated human populations that had remained genetically separate for that long. Even the most remote tribes in the Amazon or the highlands of Papua New Guinea showed clear genetic connections to other human groups. These children didn't. They were related to each other. The tests confirmed that much, siblings or possibly cousins. But their connection to the rest of humanity was distant, theoretical, visible only in the basic structure that marked them as something that had once been human or had come from the same source as humans, but had traveled a very different path. The supervisor who took Patricia's call made her run the tests a third time while he watched. When the results came back identical, he picked up a different phone, one that connected to an outside line Patricia had never seen used before. Within 4 hours, 2 men arrived at the lab. They weren't doctors. They weren't university officials. They wore badges that identified them as federal employees, but the agency names were acronyms Patricia didn't recognize. They confiscated the samples, the test results, the raw data, and every note Patricia had made. They asked her questions about who else had seen the results, who else had access to the samples, whether she'd made any copies or discussed her findings with anyone outside the lab. She answered honestly. She hadn't told anyone. She'd barely processed what she was seeing herself. The men seemed satisfied. They thanked her for her discretion and told her that the samples had been part of a classified medical study, that the abnormalities she'd noted were the result of experimental contamination, and that there was nothing to be concerned about. Patricia Gomez nodded and said she understood. 2 days later, she submitted her resignation. She never worked in genetics again. She never spoke about what she'd seen. And in 2009, 3 years after her death from lung cancer, her daughter found a safety deposit box key among her mother's belongings. And inside that box was a single sheet of paper with 3 names written on it and a note that said, "They weren't human. Not completely, and someone knew before they were ever found." The 3 children were separated within 72 hours of their DNA results being flagged. No explanation was given to the facility staff. No formal transfer orders appeared in any official documentation. The children simply disappeared from their rooms in the middle of the night. Moved by men who showed credentials but left no names, they were transported to locations that were never recorded in any file that would later be made available to journalists or researchers. Margaret Vance, the social worker who'd found them, tried to follow up on their cases and was told the children had been placed with specialized foster families, that they were receiving appropriate care, and that her services were no longer needed. When she pressed for details, when she demanded to know where they'd been taken and whether she could conduct follow-up visits, she was called into a meeting with her supervisor and 2 men from what was identified as the Department of Health and Human Services. They thanked her for her work. They assured her the children were safe, and they strongly suggested that her continued inquiries might be seen as an obstruction of a federal investigation into child endangerment and abuse. Margaret Vance had worked in social services for 19 years. She'd seen children pulled from terrible situations, seen families destroyed by poverty, addiction, and violence. But she'd never seen a case shut down with this kind of pressure, this kind of finality. She stopped asking questions, but she kept a file hidden in her home filled with copies of every document she'd managed to make before the case was sealed. The oldest girl, the one who'd made that strange humming sound when Margaret asked her name, was reportedly sent to a facility in West Virginia, a private institution that specialized in what the paperwork vaguely described as developmental disorders and genetic conditions requiring long-term residential care. The facility was remote, surrounded by fenced property, and operated with minimal oversight from state authorities. Former employees who've spoken anonymously about the place describe it as something between a hospital and a research center where children with unusual conditions were studied under the guise of treatment. The girl was given a name, Sarah Fowler. Though whether Fowler was actually the family name or just the name assigned based on the property where she was found remains unclear. Records suggest she remained at the facility until at least 1983, when references to her case stop appearing in budget documents and staff rosters. What happened to her after that is unknown. Attempts to locate Sarah Fowler through public records have turned up nothing. No death certificate, no marriage license, no driver's license or social security number activity after 1983. She's simply gone, erased as thoroughly as if she'd never existed at all. The boy and the younger girl were split up and sent to separate locations. One allegedly to a facility in upstate New York, the other to somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, possibly Oregon or Washington. The details are even more fragmentary for these two. Their assigned names appear in a handful of documents from the late 70s and early 80s, always in contexts that suggest ongoing medical observation and testing. One document obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2012 references subjects 2 and 3 from the Kentucky relocation and discusses continued monitoring of genetic anomalies and behavioral development in controlled environments. The document is heavily redacted, with entire paragraphs blacked out, but what remains visible is disturbing enough. References to non-standard physiological responses to environmental stimuli, notes about difficulty with social integration and language acquisition despite intensive intervention. A single line near the bottom of the page reads, "Recommendation: maintain separation from general population indefinitely." Subjects show signs of recognition and distress when visual contact is established with each other, suggesting continued psychological connection despite physical distance. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? What would you want to know? And what would you be afraid to find out? After the children were taken and the property burned, investigators tried to piece together the history of the Fowler clan to understand where these children had come from and what had been done to them in that house on the mountain. What they found was a genealogical nightmare, a family tree that twisted back on itself in ways that suggested generations of isolation and intermarriage. County records going back to the 1800s showed Fowlers buying and selling that same property, always keeping it within the family, always maintaining distance from the surrounding communities. Census records were spotty. But when Fowlers did appear, they were listed in small numbers, never more than 6 or 7 individuals per household, and often with notations that suggested the census takers had trouble getting accurate information. One census from 1890 included a handwritten note in the margin next to the Fowler entry, "Family uncooperative, strange dialect." Counted 8 individuals but could not verify names or ages. Advised future counters to bring assistance. Church records from the region showed no Fowlers ever baptized, married, or buried in any local congregation. They had their own cemetery on the property, a plot of land near the tree line where investigators found grave markers dating back to at least the 1820s. Most of the markers were crude, just stones with dates scratched into the surface. No names, but a few had symbols carved into them, the same symbols that had been found on the walls of that back room and on the children's scalps. When archaeologists were finally allowed to conduct a survey of the site in 1978, 2 years after the children were found, they discovered that the cemetery contained far more graves than markers. Ground-penetrating radar suggested at least 40 burial sites, possibly more, layered over time in a pattern that indicated continuous use for well over a century. The state wanted to exhume some of the remains for identification and cause of death determination, but the request was denied by federal officials who claimed the land had been contaminated during the fire and that excavation would pose environmental and health risks. The cemetery was fenced off, and within 5 years the forest had reclaimed it completely. Oral histories collected from elderly residents of Harland painted a picture of the Fowlers as a family people had always been wary of, going back to when their own grandparents were children. Stories about Fowler men coming into town for supplies, paying in old coins or bartering with furs and herbs, never speaking more than necessary, always watching with eyes that made people uncomfortable. Stories about Fowler women who never appeared in public, who were sometimes glimpsed through trees near the property line. Pale figures that moved wrong, that didn't walk so much as drift through the shadows. There were darker stories too, the kind that were told in whispers or dismissed as superstition. Stories about children who went missing near the Fowler property in the 1890s, 3 of them over the course of 2 years, never found. Stories about hunters who'd gotten too close to the Fowler land and come back changed, unable to sleep, speaking about sounds in the night and lights that moved through the trees in patterns that seemed intelligent, purposeful. One old man interviewed in 1977, shortly before he died, claimed his grandfather had told him the Fowlers weren't originally from Kentucky at all, that they'd come from somewhere further south, maybe the Carolinas or Georgia, fleeing something, running from people who wanted them dead for reasons his grandfather wouldn't explain. Researchers tried to trace the Fowler name through historical records, looking for the origin point, the place where this family had first appeared in America. They found references in North Carolina from the early 1800s, a family named Fowler living in the mountains near the Tennessee border involved in some kind of dispute with local authorities that resulted in several deaths and the family's sudden disappearance. Before that, the trail went cold. No ship manifests, no immigration records, no land grants or property deeds. It was as if the Fowlers had simply materialized in the Appalachian Mountains sometime around the turn of the 19th century and had been hiding there ever since, breeding in isolation, preserving something in their blood that they didn't want diluted or discovered. And those 3 children found in 1976, those children with their impossible DNA and their scarred scalps and their eyes that reflected light like animals, they were the end result of whatever the Fowlers had been protecting or perpetuating for all those generations. They were the proof that something had survived in those mountains, something that looked human enough to hide, but wasn't human enough to be explained. The Fowler case was sealed by federal order in 1977, less than a year after the children were discovered. All files related to the investigation, the medical examinations, the DNA analysis, and the children's subsequent placement were classified under a provision that cited national security concerns and ongoing sensitive research. Margaret Vance's reports disappeared from state archives. The police reports from Harlan County were removed from storage and never returned. Even the photographs taken of the property before it burned were confiscated from local newspaper offices by men who showed federal badges and provided receipts that were never honored. The official story, the one that appeared in the few newspaper articles published before the case went dark, was that 3 neglected children had been found living in squalor on an abandoned property, that they'd been placed in protective custody, and that criminal charges were being pursued against unknown parties. No mention of DNA, no mention of genetic anomalies, no mention of symbols or languages, or anything that might suggest this was more than a tragic case of child abuse in rural America. The property itself remained off limits for decades. The land was seized by the federal government through eminent domain proceedings in 1978, transferred to the Department of the Interior, and designated as protected wilderness, unsuitable for public access due to terrain and environmental concerns. The few people who've tried to reach the site in recent years report that the old access road has been completely reclaimed by forest and that new roads leading into the area are blocked by gates with signs warning of dangerous conditions and threatening prosecution for trespassing. Satellite imagery of the region, available through public mapping services, shows an area of dense forest canopy with no visible structures or clearings. But some researchers have noted that the imagery appears distorted or low resolution compared to surrounding areas, as though the site is being deliberately obscured or the images replaced with older, less detailed versions. Whether this is intentional or simply a quirk of how the mapping data was collected remains a matter of speculation, but it's consistent with a pattern of information control that has surrounded the Fowler case from the beginning. In 2006, 30 years after the children were found, a researcher named Daniel Morrow filed a Freedom of Information Act request seeking any and all documents related to the Fowler case and the children removed from the Kentucky property in 1976. The request was denied. Morrow appealed. The appeal was denied. He filed a lawsuit arguing that sufficient time had passed and that any legitimate security concerns should have expired. The lawsuit was dismissed on the grounds that the documents in question related to ongoing medical privacy issues and that their release would violate federal health information protection laws. Morrow tried a different approach. He began searching for the children themselves, now adults in their 40s, using the names they had been assigned and the fragmentary information he'd pieced together from unredacted portions of documents. He found nothing. No Sarah Fowler matching the right age and description. No records of the boy or the younger girl under any variation of their assigned names. It was as if they'd been erased as completely as the case files, removed from the world in a way that left no trace. Morrow died in 2011. His research notes were donated to a university archive where they remain available to researchers, a collection of dead ends and redacted documents that raise more questions than they answer. There are people who believe the children are still alive, still being held in facilities that don't appear on any map, still being studied by researchers whose work will never be published in any journal or presented at any conference. There are others who believe the children died years ago, perhaps from complications related to their unusual biology. Perhaps from something more deliberate, and that their remains are stored somewhere in a government facility alongside other things the public isn't meant to know about. And there are those who believe something darker. That whatever made those children different wasn't unique to them. That the Fowler bloodline wasn't the only one. That there are other families in other remote places carrying the same genetic legacy, the same ancient divergence that split them from the rest of humanity so long ago that we've forgotten we were ever one species. The truth is buried under layers of classification and bureaucracy and fear. Fear of what it would mean if the public knew that there are people walking among us who aren't quite human, who've been here all along hiding in the margins, preserving something old and strange and utterly incompatible with the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. Margaret Vance died in 2019. Her daughter found the hidden file and tried to bring it to journalists, to researchers, to anyone who might be interested in reopening the case. Most ignored her. A few looked at the documents and backed away, unwilling to touch something that felt dangerous, that felt like it could bring the wrong kind of attention. The file still exists, stored in a private collection, available to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to dig into it. The Fowler property is still there somewhere under the trees in eastern Kentucky. The grave still in the ground. The root cellar still open to the earth waiting. And somewhere, if they're still alive, 3 people are living with the knowledge of what they are, what was done to them, and what their blood carries. They know the truth. The question is whether the rest of us are ready to know it too, or whether some secrets are better left buried in the mountains where they've been hiding for the last 200 years, waiting for someone else to come digging and find what should have stayed lost forever.